unfold.
Okay, let's unpack this. We're diving into one of the most explosive, emotional, and historically defining nights of the 20th century, the night the Berlin Wall fell, November 9th, 1989.
It's an iconic moment.
It is.
Yeah.
And when you picture that moment, you probably see the triumph, right? You see people dancing on the concrete barriers, the champagne flowing, the just spontaneous, joyful chaos.
The victory of people power.
Exactly. It looks like the ultimate victory, maybe a grand strategy paying off, or even, a violent uprising that succeeded. But the reality we are going to explore today, the secret history hidden in the archives, in the memos, and the memories of the people on the ground, is far messier. It's far more chaotic, and frankly, it's almost hilarious in its incompetence.
It really is. The seismic collapse of this entire geopolitical order, it wasn't the result of some deliberate strategy.
Not at all. It was what historians have perfectly dubbed the accidental miracle.
A perfect name for it.
Our mission today is forensic. We're going to really forensically reconstruct the chaotic, cascading series of bureaucratic errors, the miscommunications, and the spontaneous human decisions that occurred in just a few frantic hours.
And we're going to show you exactly how a rigid totalitarian state just disintegrated in real time.
Yeah.
What's so fascinating here is that the symbolism of the wall's collapse is just so enormous. I mean, it truly was the immediate end of the Cold War that we tend to gloss over the incredible improbability of the how.
Right, we simplify it. Heroism versus tyranny.
Exactly. But the truth, as you mentioned, is a story about internal chaos, the complete freezing of middle management, and this immense, terrifying burden that gets placed on individual actors.
It all comes down to a few people in a few rooms.
It does. We're tracing the disintegration of the East German state, the GDR, from this desperate internal strategy they devised through a press conference that became a comedy of errors, and right down to the crucial decision made by one overwhelmed, lifelong Stasi border guard.
A man who found himself holding the fate of Europe and potentially hundreds of lives in his hands.
It is the ultimate study in organizational failure meeting human agency.
So to understand this immediate, irreversible failure on November 9th, you first have to appreciate that the German Democratic Republic, the GDR, it was already a corpse walking.
On life support.
By the autumn of 1989, the state was facing this existential crisis coming from two directions at once, which scholars call the exit and the voice.
It's a great framework.
Think of it like a boiler under pressure with two different safety valves failing at the same time. The exit crisis was the physical hemorrhage of the population, people literally voting with their feet and just fleeing the country.
In the voice crisis.
That was the organized, growing internal dissent, the protests, the 500,000 people in the streets demanding radical change, and the two were reinforcing each other in this deadly loop for the regime.
And we have to remember the context that allowed this pressure to build up in the first place. For 4 decades, the GDR had maintained its stability by relying on two massive, non-negotiable pillars of control.
Right.
Domestically, they had the terrifying efficiency of the Stasi security apparatus. But externally, and this is the fundamental point, they relied on the Brezhnev Doctrine.
Soviet backstop.
Exactly. The Brezhnev Doctrine was this unwritten but very real guarantee that if a satellite communist regime like the GDR was facing an internal threat or the collapse of socialist rule, the Soviet Union would intervene militarily.
Moscow's tanks would roll in.
Just as they had in Hungary in '56 and Czechoslovakia in '68. They have the ultimate failsafe for the GDR's ruling party, the SED.
But by the late 1980s, that failsafe wasn't just resting. It was explicitly disabled.
Precisely. Under Mikhail Gorbachev, the Soviet Union began pursuing policies of perestroika and glasnost, economic restructuring and political openness.
And Gorbachev explicitly signaled that the USSR would no longer intervene to prop up struggling socialist regimes.
And this policy shift became known informally and perfectly as the Sinatra Doctrine.
Because they could do it their way.
Exactly, because it meant the satellite countries could now do things their way. And the sheer weight of this erosion of state authority, you just can't overstate it.
No.
When the SED leadership realized they could no longer count on Moscow's tanks to crush the growing dissent, they were suddenly isolated, exposed.
They had to face their own population for the first time in 40 years.
And the political system was just not designed for that kind of interaction.
And that isolation, it dramatically amplified the pressure from within. So let's look at the voice crisis for a second. It wasn't just about a stagnant economy, although that certainly fueled the discontent. It was about a genuinely powerful, organized, popular movement demanding more than just better wages. They were demanding democratic reforms.
This is where we have to talk about Leipzig.
We must. The Monday demonstrations in Leipzig, they started small, often connected to local church prayer groups and peace movements. But they quickly swelled into mass protests.
And these weren't quiet little vigils.
No, these were mass movements of tens, then hundreds of thousands of people filling the streets around the ring road.
And their chant was the declaration that truly signaled the end. Wir sind das Volk. We are the people.
Such a powerful phrase.
It wasn't just a simple protest slogan. In the context of the GDR, where the ruling SED party claimed to represent the working class, this chant was a direct political challenge. It was a declaration that the party was illegitimately governing.
So the scale of these protests was it was something the regime couldn't handle without resorting to mass violence.
And thanks to the Sinatra Doctrine, they knew they couldn't risk that. They feared international backlash and maybe even internal moral resistance from their own soldiers. The regime was basically paralyzed by the scale of this voice crisis.
And that paralyzing voice was being magnified by the sheer embarrassing spectacle of the exit crisis. You see this wave start in the summer of '89. Hungary, seeking closer ties with the West, starts dismantling its border fences with Austria. This created the first real geographical crack in the Iron Curtain.
A tiny crack that became a floodgate.
Instantly, thousands of East Germans who had traveled legally to Hungary for vacations just abandoned their Trabants, their little cars, and walked across the Austrian border into freedom. It was a mass, peaceful exodus.
And when the GDR tried to restrict travel to Hungary to stem the flow, what happened?
The refugees just got smarter and more visible.
They flooded the West German embassies in Prague and Warsaw, and the visual evidence, I mean, you saw thousands of East German citizens, often families, camp for weeks in these muddy embassy courtyards.
Just waiting desperately to be granted passage.
It was a humanitarian crisis and an acute diplomatic nightmare for the GDR.
Oh, absolutely. Every day, international television showed footage of these wretched conditions, and it just utterly undermined the regime's propaganda about the superiority of the socialist state.
It made the GDR look like what it was, a failing, prison-like dictatorship.
So the regime finally tried to slam the door shut. In early October, they sealed the border to Czechoslovakia to stop people from reaching Prague and Warsaw. But like we said earlier, they didn't solve the problem. They just bottled it up.
Right.
The exit crisis immediately transformed and intensified the voice crisis because now the discontented citizens couldn't flee. They had no choice but to pour into the domestic street protests.
So by mid-October, the pressure was just unbearable.
Which is when we saw the inevitable internal political shakeup, the palace coup on October 18th. The aging hardline leader Erich Honecker was finally forced out.
Replaced by his protege, Egon Krenz.
And Krenz promised a Wende, a turnaround, but the population was sophisticated enough to see the maneuver for what it was.
He was universally viewed as old wine in new bottles. I mean, this was a man who had been on Honecker's side. He had no credibility to calm the streets.
The population was demanding systemic change, not a leadership shuffle.
And the climax of this internal pressure came on November 4th, just 5 days before the wall fell, with that monumental demonstration. 500,000 people on Alexanderplatz.
Wow.
That was the moment the leadership realized their control was purely theoretical.
And it was at this point that the Politburo, led by Krenz, made its fatal calculation. They understood they couldn't suppress the dissent violently. They needed a strategic pressure valve to stabilize the regime by regulating the exodus.
Their calculation was that if they allowed the most discontented people to leave in an orderly, legal fashion, they could stop the embarrassing embassy spectacle and hopefully retain the majority of the population by offering the prospect of travel.
This need for a cynical, controlled, bureaucratic solution to a full-blown revolutionary problem. That became the genesis of the new travel law.
And this document was intended to save the dictatorship.
But as we're about to see, its chaotic execution is what destroyed it.
This is where we move from these grand geopolitical forces to the minute, almost mundane details of bureaucratic paperwork. The stage for the accidental miracle was set early on the morning of November 9th, 1989, in a small office.
Yeah.
The task of drafting this absolutely crucial new travel regulation fell to a small working group at the Ministry of the Interior, led by Gerhard Lauder, a jurist and an officer of the People's Police.
And the atmosphere must have been one of just frantic, exhausted compromise.
Completely. And their mandate was utterly contradictory. They were told to design a system for Standige Ausreise permanent emigration directly from the GDR to West Germany.
And the goal was purely pragmatic, right? Stop the hemorrhaging of citizens through third countries, which was causing international ridicule. It had to be a controlled exit administered by the state.
Exactly. Think about the tension in that room. These are men who had dedicated their entire careers to controlling movement, and now they're being told to design a mechanism for mass one-way exit.
They were trying to thread a needle the size of the wall itself, balancing the appearance of liberalization with the preservation of state control.
The draft they produced, the source document for all the chaos, is a masterpiece of socialist bureaucratic ambiguity.
I can imagine.
The core focused on dramatically simplifying the application process for emigration. People no longer needed rigorous proof of family need or compelling reasons. They just applied.
Okay.
And here are the two key elements that were so badly misinterpreted later that evening. Firstly, the draft stated that the police were instructed to issue visas for this permanent emigration immediately. The German word they used was unverzüglich.
Okay, let's stop there on unverzüglich. That is such a classic piece of bureaucratic language, isn't it?
It's perfect, yeah.
It means something like without culpable delay or as soon as administratively possible. It's designed to signal urgency while allowing for necessary internal processing. Maybe 2 days, maybe 3. It certainly doesn't mean instantly.
Exactly. It's the language of civil service procedure, not emergency declaration. If they had intended for the border to open instantly, they would have used the words sofort or jetzt.
Right.
But they were designing a process for stamping forms and transferring records, which, takes time.
And the chaos was already being baked in even before the press conference. I read that in a very last-minute edition, intended to appease domestic critics who only wanted to visit family temporarily, not emigrate forever.
Lauder and his colleagues inserted a vague clause about private travel as well,
Which instantly muddied the water between permanent immigration and temporary visits in the final text.
Right. If the public just heard the word travel, they wouldn't stop to ask if it was Standige Ausreise or just a weekend trip.
So the critical bureaucratic safeguard, which was intended to prevent precisely the chaos that ensued, was the embargo.
The embargo. Lauder and the working group were acutely aware that the system couldn't handle an instant rush. They needed time-critical time to brief the thousands of border guards, distribute the new forms, and prepare the infrastructure.
It makes perfect sense.
So they set a strict embargo. The regulation was to be formally published in the GDR's state news media on November 10th at 4:00 a.m. That 6 to 7 hour buffer was the structural element designed to prevent the border from being overwhelmed.
And this entire cynical strategy, it all hinges on what you called the Ventilösung, the valve solution. The regime wasn't suddenly becoming liberal or kind. They were calculating that by letting the most vocal, the most aggressive, the most troublesome opponents leave the country, they could stabilize the remaining population by a form of purification.
Get the agitators out and the protests would die down. That was the theory.
And to make that purification permanent and irreversible, the Stasi had a quiet, almost malicious bureaucratic step planned.
The stamp.
The stamp. When these people went through the official process, the Stasi would stamp their passports in a way that effectively invalidated their citizenship, making it clear, this is a one-way ticket. You are permanently expelled and you will never return.
The cynicism of the regime, even as it was collapsing, was just staggering.
And they fundamentally and tragically underestimated the sheer pressure that had built up in the pipes.
And the final organizational failure happens at the very top. At 4 p.m. on November 9th, the SED Central Committee met. Egon Krenz, the new leader, read the proposal.
And the committee members were just exhausted.
Right.
Distracted by their collapsing authority.
Completely. They just rubber-stamped the resolution.
Yeah.
There was virtually no deep technical debate, certainly none about the implication of the term unverzüglich.
And this is the moment the communication chain breaks down completely. The second critical error. Before the meeting concluded, Krenz handed the press release summarizing the new rules, the now infamous Schabowski's Zettel, to Günter Schabowski, the party's secretary for information.
And Schabowski was due to run the international press conference.
But, and this is the key, Schabowski had missed the earlier Politburo meeting where that critical 4 a.m. embargo was emphasized, stressed, and debated.
He had no context.
None. And Krenz, maybe preoccupied with the collapse of his own authority, or just assuming Schabowski would carefully read the full text and understand the operational hold, utterly failed to explicitly convey the critical timing.
He just gave him the note.
He gave Schabowski the note, and Schabowski, the man of communication, left for the press center unaware he was carrying a ticking historical bomb set to detonate on live international television.
So we leave the sterility of the bureaucratic offices and arrive at the hot, smoke-filled chaos of the International Press Center on Mohrenstrasse in East Berlin. It's 6:00 p.m.
And the room is packed with journalists who can smell blood in the water. They know the GDR is teetering, but they certainly don't anticipate the drama that's about to unfold.
Not at all. For the first 50 minutes, this event was the absolute definition of socialist tedium. Journalists present used to call it the hour of boredom.
I can believe it.
Schabowski and the other officials just droned on about party renewal, upcoming conferences, and typical exhausted communist rhetoric.
The journalists must have been so frustrated listening to the same tired, unconvincing talk while 500,000 people had been protesting in the streets just days before.
Exactly. But the atmosphere shifts dramatically at 6:53 p.m. This is the precise moment the clock starts ticking.
Ricardo Ehrman?
Ricardo Ehrman, the sharp correspondent for the Italian news agency and SSA, manages to ask a question that wasn't even directly about the new travel law, but about the regime's long history of failures regarding travel.
He asks, Mr. Schabowski, you spoke about errors. Wasn't the draft of a travel law a grave error?
And Schabowski, visibly irritated at being cornered and called out on past failures, sees the note in his hand as his triumphant pivot. This new regulation, he thinks, will show the world the GDR is modernizing.
So he announces, stumbling a bit, that they had decided to implement a regulation that allows every citizen of the German Democratic Republic to leave the GDR through any of the border crossings.
And the room immediately galvanized. You could almost hear the collective gasp and the frantic scribbling of pens.
But Schabowski, remember, he missed the briefing. He's struggling.
He put on his reading glasses and begins reading from the hastily prepared note, that famous Zettel, struggling to decipher the handwritten additions and the complex bureaucratic syntax.
And the note was all about visa applications being issued unverzüglich, without delay.
And the reporters, sensing the enormity of this, started shouting.
Oh.
Peter Brinkmann, of the influential West German tabloid Bild, was particularly aggressive, demanding to know, from when does that apply?
The flashpoint. This is the specific question that history pivoted on.
It is. Schabowski scratched his head. He glanced at the note. He saw the word unverzüglich immediately without delay, which, as we discussed, referred to the processing of the application.
But not knowing the context of the 4 a.m. embargo, he mistakenly applied the urgency to the law's validity itself.
The fatal slip came at 6:57 p.m. He looks up and says, hesitantly, that comes into effect, according to my information, immediately without delay.
And he uses two German words, amplifying a mistake. Das tritt nach meiner Kenntnis. Ist das sofort unverzüglich?
The inclusion of sofort instantly, alongside the bureaucratic unverzüglich, was catastrophic. He had just transformed an internal processing mandate into a public declaration of instantaneous border opening.
But the mistake wasn't fully complete yet, was it? He had announced the immediate opening of a bureaucratic process. The physical wall was still technically protected.
Correct. Then came the second, equally fatal error, just moments later.
A reporter, still processing the shock, asked the absolutely crucial follow-up question that closed the loop. Does this also apply to West Berlin?
If Schabowski had paused, consulted his aides, or simply said, no, this only applies to the main border crossings to West Germany, the wall remains fortified, the night might have ended with controlled chaos tomorrow morning.
But he didn't.
No. Schabowski, exhausted, trying to sound authoritative, just shrugged and confirmed that permanent exits could take place via all border crossings to the FRG and West Berlin, respectively.
And that, ladies and gentlemen, was it. By explicitly linking immediately, sofort, to West Berlin, the location of the most sensitive physical wall crossings, Schabowski had transformed a dreary, technical regulatory announcement into the immediate physical opening of the Iron Curtain.
He closed his folder at 7 p.m. He had just signaled the immediate end of the border regime, completely oblivious to the fact that he hadn't just announced a minor policy change. He had initiated the irreversible collapse of his government.
We really need to linger on the linguistic analysis for a moment because this is the key piece of evidence showing the accidental nature of the event.
The difference between unverzüglich and sofort is absolutely vital.
Unverzüglich is passive. It requires action from the state, right, processing form.
And sofort is active. It requires action from the people going to the border.
So Schabowski took an instruction meant for internal police officers about processing speed and weaponized it for the public, who interpreted it as an order to travel speed.
It's the perfect bureaucratic failure. The drafters used unverzüglich precisely to maintain control and administrative capacity. They built 2 days of operational buffer into that single word.
And Schabowski, by pairing it with the far more forceful populist sofort, accidentally destroyed that buffer in 4 seconds of dialogue.
The distinction between applying for a visa immediately and crossing the border immediately was completely lost in the media rush. And critically, the other officials present, the men who had attended the earlier briefings and knew about the 4 a.m. hold, they just sat there, frozen.
They were completely unable or unwilling to correct their superior on live television.
They prioritized internal party hierarchy over the impending national security crisis. It's astonishing.
The moment Schabowski closed that folder at 7:00 p.m., the situation shifted. The fate of the wall was no longer a bureaucratic mistake to be contained, but a historical inevitability driven by the West German media acting as a massive multiplier.
The race to the wire.
Ricardo Ehrman, the correspondent who asked the trigger question, rushed straight to the telex machine, the old technology of instant news transmission. The wire services knew they had an earth-shattering exclusive.
And the speed was astonishing. Reuters was first, flashing the headline across the globe at 7:05 p.m. GDR opens border.
The West German Deutsche Presseagentur, DPA, followed quickly. GDR opens border immediately.
And just like that, the nuance, the sophistication of Lauder's legalistic draft, all the talk of applications, stamping, and approvals, it evaporated entirely.
It was replaced by a binary, explosive, and simple headline. The wall is open. The media didn't report the policy change. They reported the implication of the official's flustered statement.
This is where we talk directly to you, the listener, about the infrastructure of division. It is so vital to remember the role of West German television.
The vast majority of East Germans watched Western news channels like ARD and ZDF. They trusted them far, far more than their own state media, Aktuelle Kamera,
which was widely seen as boring, predictable, and just dishonest propaganda.
So when the news came on West German TV, it had instant, unimpeachable credibility within East German households.
And the real game changer aired at 8 p.m., the influential West German news program Tagesschau.
Yes. The anchor, Hans-Joachim Friedrichs, opened the broadcast with a statement that was technically premature. It was based only on the confusing wire reports, but which became the singularly most effective, prophetically self-fulfilling statement of the night.
We have to quote the crucial line again because its phrasing is what drove thousands to the gates. Friedrichs began by saying, "Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. One should be cautious with superlatives. They tend to wear out fast. But this evening, it is permissible to risk one. This 9th of November is a historic day."
And then he said it. The GDR has announced that its borders are open to everyone as of now. The gates in the wall are wide open.
As of now. He used the present tense. He didn't say the borders will open tomorrow after applications are processed.
He declared the borders are open and the gates are wide open. He didn't report a decision. He reported a reality.
And that broadcast was the irrevocable turning point. Suddenly, thousands upon thousands of East Berliners sitting in their small apartments in districts like Prenzlauer Berg and Pankow saw the news on their own trusted television screens.
If Tagesschau said the gates were open, it was true. Period.
The consequence was immediate mass mobilization. We're talking about thousands of people who spent 40 years under totalitarian rule, who were suddenly given a public official license reported by a credible source to seek freedom.
They grabbed their ID cards, put on their coats, and headed straight for the nearest checkpoint.
The Western media had acted as an inadvertent, self-reinforcing feedback loop. It transformed a bureaucratic error made by an ill-informed functionary into a fait accompli, driven by the collective action of the population.
The state leadership's mistake was instantly broadcast, internalized, and acted upon by the citizens before the Central Committee even finished debating what their own instructions meant.
So the collapse wasn't triggered by a policy change. It was triggered by a belief in a policy change that hadn't even happened yet.
That's the real insight here. The system died because the information vacuum created by the state's incompetence was immediately filled by external, credible information that gave the citizens the confidence to act.
And that's where the pressure cooker of the geopolitical moment, the ambiguity of the bureaucracy, and the acceleration of the media all converge on one tiny physical location in East Berlin.
Bornholmer Strasse.
The Bornholmer Strasse border crossing. This was a heavily fortified crossing that connected East Berlin's Soviet sector to West Berlin's French sector via the Bosebrück Bridge. It was the front line of the Cold War.
And the man in charge was Lieutenant Colonel Harald Jäger.
Jäger is the true hero of this accidental miracle, and we really need to spend time understanding his position. He was not a liberal, not a dissenter.
No, he was a loyal, disciplined Stasi officer with 25 years of service. He commanded a critical crossing and fundamentally believed, until that moment, that the wall was a necessary shield protecting the socialist state from Western decay.
He was a cog in the machine, a highly disciplined one.
Picture the scene. It's 6:00 p.m. Jäger is sitting in the border canteen, eating his supper, half watching the famously boring press conference.
And when Schabowski mumbles the word "sofort" immediately, Jäger is so shocked that he physically chokes on his food.
He shouts, "Some Quatsch, such nonsense, bullshit," at the screen.
Because he knew, with the cold, brutal logic of a career border guard, that immediate, uncontrolled travel without passports, visas, or forms was impossible. It meant immediate, complete loss of control. It was a security disaster.
So he immediately calls his superior, Colonel Rudi Ziegenhorn, at Stasi operational headquarters. And this is the moment of truth. The chain of command, which had been the backbone of the GDR for 40 years, instantly failed.
Jäger reported what he heard on Western TV. Ziegenhorn's initial response was just bureaucratic paralysis mixed with dismissal. Schabowski's talking nonsense. Nothing has changed. His business as usual. Maintain the border.
He was ordered to follow standard protocol, which meant sealing the gate.
But the reality outside Jäger's checkpoint window was escalating minute by minute. Initially, it was just a few dozen tentative people showing up, politely clutching their ID cards and quoting Schabowski. The guards told them to go home.
But by 8:30 p.m., after the Tagesschau broadcast, that trickle turned into a torrent.
The crowd swelled to thousands, and crucially, their mood shifted. They weren't curious anymore, they were demanding. They were chanting loudly, rhythmically, and dangerously. Tore off! Tore off! Open the gate!
Jäger was now facing a critical mass, a physical and political emergency. He called Ziegenhorn again, reporting that thousands of people were pressing against the barrier. The atmosphere was turning from demanding to dangerous.
And this is where Ziegenhorn, the middle manager, commits the ultimate command error, the third critical failure. Instead of giving a firm order, he tried to manage his own political risk.
He puts Jäger on speakerphone.
And astonishingly, he asked his colleagues at headquarters, is Jäger capable of assessing the situation correctly? Is he panicking? Ziegenhorn gave Jäger no clear order, neither to open the gate, nor, more terrifyingly, to use force.
And Jäger, the loyal officer, suddenly realized the game. The Stasi hierarchy was setting him up as a scapegoat. If he ordered force, he would be blamed for the ensuing bloodbath. If he opened the gate, he would be blamed for the state's collapse.
He later recounted his feeling of just utter betrayal by his superiors. The rigid hierarchy of the totalitarian state had dissolved, leaving the junior officer, the man on the ground, to handle a catastrophic political failure that originated at the top.
The system had sacrificed its foot soldiers to save its own political reputation.
Around 9:30 p.m., Ziegenhorn, still desperate for a non-violent face-saving solution, authorized a limited tactic, reverting to the original failed Ventiluzum.
The instruction was, identify the most aggressive agitators, let a few of them pass through to West Berlin, but critically, invalidate their ID cards with a stamp indicating expatriation.
The purpose was cynical. Release just enough steam to save the boiler while permanently getting rid of the most troublesome opponents. The result was instantaneous disaster.
As the first few people were let through, the crowd didn't calm down. They cheered wildly, interpreting the small opening as a victory. A sign that Tagesschau was right.
The pressure on the barrier intensified. They demanded the same access.
And the situation quickly became impossible to maintain. The one-way ticket deception caused immense panic. Families were separated, some members went through, others were forced to stay.
And rumors spread like wildfire through the crowd that this was a trap, that those who left could never return. The fear, combined with the hope, became an unbearable, escalating force.
The valve didn't stabilize the state. It created a pressure surge that threatened to burst the entire apparatus.
The physical reality reached critical mass by 11:30 p.m., We're talking about 20,000 people packed tightly into the approach roads to Bornholmer Strasse. The physical pressure on the barrier was overwhelming.
And Jäger's guards, who were trained to fight lone runners, were utterly terrified. Outnumbered 1,000 to 1, fearing they would be crushed or perhaps lynched if the crowd surged.
Jäger looked at the crowd. They weren't counter-revolutionary agents in military fatigues. They were his neighbors. They were families, ordinary citizens demanding a right their own government had apparently granted them.
He spoke to his exhausted, scared men, some of whom were starting to cry under the pressure.
He called Ziegenhorn one last time, reporting the utter failure of the valve and the danger of the situation. And Ziegenhorn, having utterly abdicated, offered no new orders, simply referring Jäger back to the general guidelines.
Harald Jäger, the lifelong Stasi officer, hung up the phone.
He had a moment of profound moral choice. He could follow the last official order, maintain the border, use water cannons, or ultimately open fire, or he could choose humanity.
He knew if he ordered his men to use force, the bloodshed would be monumental and irreversible.
So he turned to his subordinates and gave the order that transcended his training, his loyalty, and his entire life's work. It was an operational command, but it was also a personal, moral decision.
Mach den Schlagbaum auf. Wir fluten jetzt. Open the barrier. We are flooding now.
With Jäger's desperate humanitarian order, the barriers at Bornholmer Strasse swung open at 11:30 p.m. And the resulting scene is one of the great historical ruptures.
There was a moment of surreal hesitation from the crowd, a pause of utter disbelief, wondering if it was a trick. And then they surged forward.
They poured through. No checks, no stamps, no questions asked. Just an unstoppable human river flowing into freedom.
And the scenes in West Berlin were immediate and visceral. In the wedding district, West Berliners greeted the East Berliners not with skepticism, but with pure joy. Champagne, flowers, and tears.
Strangers fell into each other's arms, sharing bottles of sparkling wine. The air was filled with the popping of corks and the distinct acrid smell of two-stroke engine exhaust from the endless line of Trabants rolling into the west.
Jäger's reaction is the defining emotional takeaway of the whole event. His world, the rigid ideology he had served for 25 years, had collapsed utterly in one moment.
But he also felt profound relief. He said later, "My world collapsed, but I saved lives."
His decision, a desperate, almost bureaucratic survival tactic to avoid responsibility for a massacre, ultimately aligned with basic human morality, and in doing so, allowed a peaceful revolution.
And the news of the breach spread instantly, and the dominoes fell fast. Bornholmer is open.
Right. Other key checkpoints, realizing the central command structure was non-functional and facing similar pressures and media reports, opened shortly before midnight. Invalidenstrasse, Checkpoint Charlie, Sonnenallee.
The Brandenburg Gate quickly became the symbolic center of the celebration. While not a formal crossing, West Berliners scaled the thick concrete wall, dancing on the rounded pipe that topped it.
East German guards initially tried to push them back with weak water cannons, but they soon gave up, recognizing the futility.
This is where the first Mauerspecht, the wall woodpeckers, appeared. They brought hammers and chisels and began chipping away at the concrete. By midnight, every crossing in Berlin was open. The accidental miracle was complete.
So, if we are to structure this chaos for clarity, we can isolate the organizational failures into three critical cascading errors, all rooted in the arrogance and rigidity of the dying state structure.
First, you had the drafting error. This was the deep ambiguity in Gerhard Lauder's draft, conflating visa application procedure with the public's desire for immediate travel.
And that was amplified by the disastrous choice of the bureaucratic word unverzüglich. They created a legal time bomb.
Second, the communication error. This was Krenz's fundamental, almost arrogant failure to convey the absolutely critical 4.0 a.m. embargo to Schabowski.
The party leadership failed to manage the transmission of its own desperate strategy, which resulted in the premature announcement that mobilized the crowds hours too early.
And third, the command error. This was the organizational death throes demonstrated by the Stasi leadership, specifically Colonel Ziegenhorn, who refused to give Jäger clear orders neither to open nor to shoot.
Which created a complete operational vacuum that forced the local commander, Jäger, to take personal, life-altering responsibility for an institutional failure.
This whole event is a remarkable textbook case study in the sociology of collapse. The Politburo was disconnected and panicked. The middle layer, Ziegenhorn, he froze, unable to risk making an autonomous mistake.
And the bottom layer, the guards like Jäger, were left operating in a total information and command vacuum.
And what filled that void?
The Western media. The people learned about their own government's alleged decision via trusted sources like Tagesschau. This brings us directly to a key sociological concept, the Thomas theorem.
If men define situations as real, they are real in their consequences.
Exactly. The media reported the wall open even though the procedure hadn't started. The people believed it and acted as if the wall were truly open.
And the sheer collective force of their peaceful action made the border guards' position untenable, thus making the initial media report a reality.
Furthermore, the psychology of that crowd was profoundly important. They weren't sneaking or rioting.
No, they acted with confidence, waving their official ID cards, claiming a legal right based on their government's announcement. This confidence, this performance of legality, was a nonviolent weapon that fundamentally disarmed the guards.
It is much, much harder for a border guard to shoot a civilian who is confidently and legally claiming their right than one who is attempting to sneak across under cover of darkness.
The citizens weaponized the bureaucracy's own mistake.
And that leads us back one last time to Harald Jäger. His decision, though born out of the immediate pressure of the moment and a desire to avoid being blamed for bloodshed, is often viewed through the lens of the banality of good. Tyranny and rigid control rely on individuals willingly suppressing their moral instincts and simply following orders. When the systemic cost of that suppression, facing down 20,000 neighbors with no clear supportive order from your superiors, becomes too high, the system simply crumbles under the weight of basic humanity.
Jäger's choice proved that the system could not withstand the moral pressure placed on one individual.
And the final, non-negotiable piece of the puzzle that ensured the peace, the geopolitical factor. The Soviet Union did not intervene.
Gorbachev accepted the new reality. The 350,000 Soviet troops stationed in East Germany remained in their barracks. No intervention meant no bloodshed, turning an accidental crisis into a peaceful, unintended revolution that changed the course of history.
So the story of the Berlin Wall's fall is the ultimate accidental miracle thesis. The structural causes, the stagnant economy, the democratic yearning, the loss of Soviet support, they made the collapse inevitable.
But the moment of liberation, the specific timing and peaceful manner of the breach, was triggered by a specific set of human and bureaucratic errors.
A tired politician reading the wrong piece of paper, and an exhausted commander choosing humanity over ideology.
It is a permanent and profound reminder of the power of contingency. Even the most potent, heavily fortified symbols of division can fall, not through grand military strategy or frontal assault, but through a string of organizational failures and the collective power of people acting on a misreported truth.
The citizens at Bornholmer Strasse weaponized peace, confidence, and media misinformation to bring down a superpower-backed regime overnight. And this raises an important question for you to mull over long after this deep dive is done. In modern closed societies, where information control is paramount, but instantaneous communication is a constant threat, think of encrypted messaging and social media, what combination of systemic collapse and instantaneous communication could create a similar, immediate, and peaceful rupture today?